AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about national security. Today, I have a very thought-provoking guest. His name is James Scott. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a New York Times prize-winning author. He is a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard and a much sought-after public speaker. He has a whole series of books that he has written on national security issues. And he and former U.S. Navy SEAL Jack Carr have a brand new book out entitled Targeted Beirut. It's the story of the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in October of 1983. James, welcome to AFIO Now.
Jim, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
James, I think our audience would appreciate knowing just a little bit about some of the sources that you were able to access when you were doing research on your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you noted, this book really looks at Beirut in 1983. So we really begin with the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in April and then build up to the much larger targeting of Marine headquarters and barracks in October. And then, of course, round out that story when the United States makes the decision to pull out of Beirut, pull the troops back aboard ship in February of 1984. And so that's just the window that we're looking at there. And so to tell the story, Jack and I we depended on archival research from the Marine Archives in Quantico, which is a wealth of information. Not only did they have the monthly command chronologies, the weekly situation reports, and even the daily message traffic, they also happened to have a pretty extensive oral history collection from that time period. The Marines had the wherewithal to begin oral histories in 1982, when the United States first went into Lebanon, and carried that all the way through until 1984. So some of the key individuals, people like Colonel Timothy Garrity, who was the commander at the time of the bombing, was actually interviewed both before and after the bombing. So we have him literally right around the time of this calamity talking about it. So the Marine Archives were a great help. We also spent a good bit of time at the Reagan Archives out in California. Of course, that's where all the white papers and the briefing papers and the meeting minutes and things of that were kept. And then, of course, a big part of the story was looking at the human cost of this. And so we did extensive interviews with survivors. The attack, we did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors, with widows, with children, with family members. And we collected more than 1,000 pages of letters and diaries from the men who were there. Because really, Jack and I very early on wanted to really shine a light on the human element of this attack. And so often, particularly nowadays and with everything going on in the world, these types of events they dominate the news cycle for a few days and then something else takes its place. But for these families and for these survivors, this becomes a fulcrum on which so much of their life will forever shift. And so we really wanted to put the spotlight on those individuals. And so having access to dozens of survivors, having access to their letters, diaries, things like that, I think really enriched the material for the book.
What parallels did you draw between the U.S. Embassy bombing in April and then the subsequent Marine barracks bombing in October?
Yeah, I mean, there of course, both of these are pushed by what today we now know of as Hezbollah, right? And I think the embassy in a lot of ways is really a trial balloon. In Beirut at that time, you have to remember car bombs were really, they were very common. So common, in fact, that there was a guy in Lebanon and Beirut whose job was to go around and defuse car bombs. Granted, he only had 8 fingers, which is, I guess, a occupational hazard when you do that. But that's just how prevalent these types of events were. What made the bombing of the embassy different is that it was actually not a part remotely detonated bomb, but a suicide bomber. And that really was a pretty big game change. And we were slow to realize that, the Americans were. In fact, actually, after that happened, I think there was a lot of thought that, well, hey, this is like a car bomb. Yes, it's a little bit different, but this, again, is the capital of car bombs. Even Lebanese officials were telling the Americans, hey, yes, it's a little bit different, but again, it fits the general MO. Of course, it would not be until October when a similar, in this case, a Mercedes truck filled with far more explosives, that the Marines, that we put two and two together and realized that this was, in fact, a very different style of attack and a far more deadly attack. And so in a lot of ways, really, the embassy bombing is it's the trial run. And of course, Hezbollah learned that it worked in that case, that the defenses were weak there. I mean, the Americans were criticized in the immediate aftermath of that for not having more comparable defenses even to other Western powers that were there. But of course, that then sort of set the stage for what you see in October, which is a far bigger bomb and which is a far deadlier attack.
Yeah. I mentioned to you off camera that I was actually serving in the area during that period, but not involved in those events. My reaction at the time was that we as a government really did not do a good job of anticipating the next threat. We always seemed to be defending against the last threat. And our adversaries were evolving a lot more faster on the offensive side than we were on the defensive side.
And that's really common in warfare. I mean, you're always looking at what you learned in the last fight and trying to figure out how to apply it. And meanwhile, the battlefield evolves and the tactics change. And that's exactly what happened in this case. You're right.
How did the Marines' initial mission description limit their ability to defend themselves? And how did that change after the USS New Jersey bombarded Sukhoi?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the heart of what this story really is and what this book is. Because the Marines went in initially, and I know a lot of your audience will be familiar with this time period, but they initially went in to help get the PLO out of Lebanon in 1982. And of course, and there was a lot of reluctance by the Joint Chiefs and by Caspar Weinberger, who was Reagan's defense secretary, to want to involve the Marines in Lebanon at that time. I mean, they really viewed this as a lot of risk and little reward. And more importantly, they viewed it as a sideshow to the larger conflict, which was, of course, the Cold War. And getting pulled into an area like this where we could be victims of proxy fighting, in this case, Syrians were backed by the Russians, you had all sorts of different militia groups there. They really just didn't see a big upside for us to go in there. And so they really wanted to restrict how long we were there. And so as soon as we get in, as soon as we get the PLO out, of course, Weinberger orders the Marines pulled back aboard ship. And of course, soon thereafter, you see the assassination of Bashir Gemayel, who was the president. You then see the massacre of the Palestinians in the refugee camps there. And of course, then the world pressure then really escalates for the Americans to come back in. And that's the crux of it, is that when we go back in that second time, we don't have a clear mission like we did the first time. Of course, going in the first time, it's get the PLO out. They're gone. You leave. Mission accomplished. You go. You go back in the second time, and we didn't really have any clear sense of what the purpose was going to be. And a lot of folks, like General John Vesey, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thought, hey, we'll go in, we'll spend a few months, we'll get the guilt out of our system over this, and then we'll withdraw. And of course, what happens is after we go in, you start seeing the mission changing, at least coming out of the National Security Council meetings and the directives that Reagan was signing. From suddenly being a stabilizing force, if you look at one of Reagan's early national security directives in the fall of 1982, you suddenly start seeing language about helping to build up the Lebanese central government's military, providing training, providing equipment, stabilization, things like that. So the mission very quickly evolves from, hey, we're just going to go there and stabilize things, to we're going to go there and really end up being a nation-building force. And of course, as so many of your audience members are going to know, that, of course, is a recipe for turning this into a long-term prospect of being there. And that's exactly what happened. So we get, a lot of ways, we got stuck there. And then in the immediate aftermath of that, of course, after the Israelis had sort of battered the Syrians, the Russians come in, they rearm the Syrians, who at that point then are much less likely to want to negotiate a withdrawal. The Israelis are tired of getting beaten up on and dealing with all the domestic conflict there. They're looking to pull out. And of course, at that point, you look at Lebanon in a lot of ways like a stool, and the legs start getting pulled out from under it, and it gets increasingly wobbly. Into that chaos, of course, comes Iran. And they send Revolutionary Guardsmen in there to take advantage of this chaotic scene and to seize that initiative to spread their revolution and create more violence. And of course, the Americans are right there in the middle of it all and are a target.
How did the McFarland-Weinberger relationship complicate the situation?
Big time, I would say. And what it really comes down to is you have just two very different ideas about what America was going to try to do there. And, Weinberger and John Vesey and the Joint Chiefs on one side really did not want any American involvement there, as I noted earlier. This was a sideshow, it was a distraction. It carried only risk and no reward. And on the flip side of that, you had the State Department, George Shultz, and you also had Bud McFarlane, who during this time period is going to get promoted to being National Security Advisor. And they saw this as a real opportunity for nation building and just go in there and turn Lebanon into a American and Israeli ally and just build it up as a stable force there. And so you have these two competing ideas that are going on there. And of course, one of the conflicts is, and this would lead inherently to great conflict. And Reagan one of his strengths was not managing conflict between his senior aides. If anything, he had a real tendency to shut down when his aides would fight amongst one another, or he would look for compromise instead of making the best solution. He looked for a way to split the baby, so to speak, amongst his advisors. And so what ultimately happens is this helps create the paralysis that's going to carry on from late 82 into early 83. Then you're going to see the attacks on the Marines begin starting in March, bombing of the embassy in April, and by the summer of 83, the violence is really going to escalate leading up to the bombing in October. But that relationship, that tension between Weinberger, Shultz, and McFarlane really creates that paralysis that prevents Reagan and Washington from being able to make any better decision. Like, do we pull out or do we send more troops? Do we change the rules of engagement? All these were types of things that should have been debated and whatnot that really weren't. And as a result, of course, it sowed the seeds of the tragedy.
Finally emerged as the planners for the operation, and with the support from whom?
Yeah, so basically what happens, as I noted earlier, Iran comes in, and Iran recognizes that here's an opportunity essentially to set up terrorist training camps and terrorist incubators. And they do it up in the Bekaa Valley area up near Syria, which at that point was kind of this no man's land. So they send in about 800 Revolutionary Guardsmen there, and they start then fanning out through the impoverished Shiite communities around southern Beirut, looking to tap into that hostility and resentment that has long been building there because of the demographic challenges in Beirut. You had a power structure that was dominated by the Christians, and then the Sunnis and the Shias were at the bottom of the order there, and so they were very disenfranchised, and Iran capitalizes on that. And so they start training, providing funding, providing resources for these homegrown terror groups, and basically helping to build up that terrorism infrastructure at that time period. And that's going to be, and of course, that's going to ultimately be the genesis of Hezbollah. At that time, it's Islamic Amal and some other small groups and things like that. But eventually, they're going to come together and be known by what we know them today as Hezbollah. And of course, their big backer is going to be Iran.
Yeah, I would say with the Beirut embassy bombing and then the Marine barracks bombing, we only really began to understand the threat that Iran and Iranian surrogates were presenting to the United States, and in particular, what became a very substantial supply line from Iran by way of Damascus right into the Sheikh Abdullah Barracks in the northern Bekaa Valley. And that's where the whole construct of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps support for and training of Hezbollah really began. And I mean, we observed that over time, but these were first really deadly instances of that support.
Exactly. That's been so fascinating just in the last week, watching everything in Syria and see what a blow that is. Yet another blow to Iran after Hamas, after Hezbollah, and now Syria. I mean, even though we're talking about events from 41 years ago, it's still so relevant today.
Please describe briefly the attack on the barracks.
Yeah.
And the multiple rescue and recovery operations that went on after that.
Yeah, and that was the heart of the book in a lot of ways. I mean, that's about a third of the book takes place just on October 23rd in 1983. And how the attack unfolds is, of course, Hezbollah and its operatives at that point had been watching the Marines. And because the Marines were there, it was a very nebulous mission. They were there as a stabilizing force, as sort of a peacekeeping. And throughout this whole time period, in order to maintain that sense of openness and whatnot, they had not locked down to a level that they should have at the base. And so it made them, in some ways, a real soft target. And Sunday mornings, of course, was the day that the Marines were allowed to sleep in an hour later than normal. So they had more time. They were off their guard at that day. Typically, Sundays were a day of rest. They played football. They had cookouts. It was relaxing. And so what happens then is you have a suicide driver in a Mercedes truck that is loaded down with commercial explosives that are then wrapped in gas, is able to bust through the very limited security perimeter that they have there, cover the few hundred yards from the gate to the battalion landing team headquarters, and penetrate inside of that building. And just so your listeners know, what the building was. It's typically called the Marine Barracks, but it was actually really the Marine headquarters for the battalion that was there. It had been the old aviation authority for the Lebanese government at that time. And so it was a big office building, but it was a lot like an embassy suites. It's one of those buildings that has sort of a big, large atrium that goes several stories up in the middle. And of course, it's ringed by balconies all the way around on all sides. So it's hollow in the middle. And of course, in addition to being where you had the medical unit and the headquarters and the other administrative services, a lot of Marines also used it, particularly as the gunfire and artillery escalated. They would sleep there at night too. And that's where the name the Barracks comes from. What happens then is that truck is able to, from the time it breaks through security and to penetrate inside that lobby, it takes just 10 seconds. That's it. Of course, it gets inside there, it detonates, and it is what the FBI will later say the largest non-nuclear explosion they've ever investigated. It's huge. The architecture of the building is such that that hollow inside really helps to, in a lot of ways, magnify the explosion, because all that escaping pressure goes vertical, hits the roof, and then bounces back down. It then blows out through all the rooms on each side of it. So you literally had cases where Marines, and there were two Marines literally on the third floor, both of whom survived, happened to be by the windows. As that air pressure then is rushing out, it literally hurled them outside the building from the third floor up to the ground below. One of those Marines was ultimately buried in the rubble. The other actually was blown clear of it. Very quickly, the building literally just pancakes upon itself all the way down. Inside, you had approximately 350 Marines. You also had sailors that were there and some soldiers as well. Of course, sailors are there because the Marines, they don't have their own chaplain service. They don't have their own medical service. So the Navy frequently deploys with them. That's why you had sailors there. And of course, the Army was there as well, helping to run some of the radar systems that the Marines were using to figure out where the attacks were coming from. All this occurs literally in a matter of seconds. Happens at 6:21 in the morning. Majority of the Marines there are sleeping. The blast, as I noted, is just huge. Literally, Marines that are in tents a quarter of a mile away, literally their tents are blown over. They can actually, out on the ships that are there, they can actually feel the vibration that comes from this explosion. It's that powerful. Of course, the Marines at that point who've been sleeping, many of them are waking up in their tents. They've been blown out of their cots, things like that. They rush to the bomb site. They're stunned because it's hard to see anything. All this pulverized concrete and whatnot, it's turned the air completely white. It looks just like it did after 9/11, sort of that clouds of white dust everywhere. But as that dust begins to clear, these men can see that the BLT is literally about a 1.5-story rubble pile. And at that point, they do what Marines do best. They try to rescue one another. They literally attack it with their hands. They attack it with K-bar knives, shovels that they can find, sledgehammers. And literally, Jack and I had at one of the reunions, a guy come up to us and he still had scars on the tips of his fingers from digging at that rubble with his bare hands. Of course, inside that rubble are trapped and or killed hundreds of Americans. And so some of these guys are stuck in air pockets. There maybe two walls collapse to form an A-frame. Maybe they're trapped underneath a desk or a cot. So at this point, it really becomes a race against time to try and dig as many survivors out as they can.
What was the U.S. government's initial reaction to the attack, and what was the ultimate outcome?
Yeah, so initially, of course, Reagan, of course, is at Augusta National at this point. Yeah, this is the same weekend that Grenada takes place. There's a lot going on in Washington at that point. There's also a hostage situation at Augusta where some White House staffers are taken hostage in the pro shop there. So it's really just a chaotic weekend for the Ronald Reagan White House. But initially, he stands firm. He says that the United States is not going to be driven out. this point, we're going to stand by the Lebanese. We're going to maintain our position there. And that's kind of what ultimately happens as October turns into November, as the rescue efforts are going to take place throughout the day of the 23rd. The last survivor will be pulled out about 5 hours afterwards. He was the chaplain, Danny Wheeler, who was the last one out. The effort to recover all the bodies will take several more days, of course, and then the effort to deconstruct the pile, find all the classified materials, equipment, things like that's going to go on for a while. And then, of course, the investigation. Meanwhile, additional Marines are flown in from Camp Lejeune to augment those men that were killed. And, of course, the MAO that was there, the Marine Amphibious Unit that was there, is going to rotate out in November, and a new group's going to come in. So everything in the fall is going to be the sense that we are continuing to maintain the mission that we had, which is this one of stabilization. However, there's going to be lots more security, many more sandbags, literally shipping containers are going to be buried underground. Basically, the troops that are there are going to be moving underground. Huge debate's going to play out in Washington during that time period. There'll be congressional hearings. Weinberger will testify. Schultz will testify. Colonel Timothy Garrity, who's the commander over there, is going to be called in to testify. There's an investigation of the Defense Department, congressional investigation, a lot going on. And of course, meanwhile, the violence in Lebanon is going to continue. More Marines are going to get killed in sniper attacks and things like that. And of course, what you're going to see is that the government of Amin Gemayel, who's the younger brother of Bashir, he was never as strong or as controlling as his brother. He didn't really have the trust a lot of even the Maronite Christians. And his government's really just already kind of teetering. And of course, that's going to completely collapse in early 1984. And with the collapse of the Gemayel government, the military are going to walk away. At that point, there's really nothing left for America to do. And that's really with that point when even the last holdouts, guys like Schultz, guys like McFarland, who've been pushing for America to stay involved, even they realize at that point that the mission's over. And in late February, the Marines head back aboard ship. And the mission pretty much wraps up at that point. We head out of Lebanon.
And which individuals were held responsible for the many Marine deaths?
2. That's it. They were Colonel Garrity, whom I've already mentioned. He, of course, was the commander of the MAO there. And his second in command after him was Gerlach. Lieutenant Colonel Gerlach was the head. He was actually commander of the actual infantry unit, the 1/8 that was there. The 2 of them, Gerlach, of course, was very seriously wounded. He was left in a wheelchair for the rest of his life as a result of this. Garrity was actually in a different building, so he was not directly impacted by it. He did manage the rescue efforts, but of course, they were essentially the 2 that were blamed. And of course, as we all know, blame always goes down the chain of command. And so, and Garrity, I think, had one of the best lines ever. He said, the mission changed, but no one changed the mission. And what he means by that is that when they arrived over there they arrived into one world of Lebanon. And by the time of the bombing, the facts on the ground had changed so dramatically that it was a whole different setup. And along the way, despite letting everybody know off the chain of command what was going on, the attacks, the Marines getting targeted, things like that, nobody stepped in, nobody changed the rules of engagement, nobody changed any of the mission parameters for them. And so they were still basically operating on a very outdated set of orders and rules of engagement. And that set in motion this tragedy. But nobody above Garrity was punished.
You and Jack have spent a lot of time studying U.S. military engagements. And obviously you did a very thorough job in researching this particular event. What lessons should we learn?
Yeah, there are a couple actually, and one of them we haven't even talked about yet was sort of the ill-fated effort to avenge what happened there. And of course, initially Reagan was very reluctant to do any kind of retaliation. There were voices inside his administration calling for America to retaliate. We don't retaliate directly for the Marines, but of course, while our Navy planes are flying over, some Syrian anti-aircraft guns sort of lock on them and shoot at them. That's what ultimately prompts us to plan a mission to retaliate. And we're not going to retaliate for the bombing, but we're going to retaliate against the Syrians. And of course, that mission ends up being pretty much a disaster for a lot of tactical reasons, timing and takeoff, things of that nature. A couple of airmen are shot down and one's killed. And of course, that then becomes, and then that sort of is the lead up to the pullout. And so we have this sort of failed effort to retaliate. And it's not even a direct retaliation for the bombing of the embassy or the Marines. And then we leave. And so I think the biggest lesson was the message that we sent to Iran. And that is that terrorism works, in that for a very inexpensive price, a Mercedes truck, the life of one volunteer, and some explosives, you can kill a whole lot of Americans. You can change American policy, in this case, prompt the Americans to pull out, and there are no consequences for that action. And so that, I think, really that sets the stage for a lot of these attacks that you're going to see follow. And one of the things I found, Jack and I both found that was so haunting, is when we were reading the congressional testimony in November of 1983, General Paul Kelly, PX Kelly, who was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, was testifying before Congress. And a lot of the lawmakers were really sort of getting on him about the security and things like that at the Marine headquarters. And he kept trying to divert them away and say, you're kind of missing the forest for the trees here. Yes, security is an issue, but this is a new form of warfare. This is different. And lawmakers keep sort of going back to this smaller issue of security. And finally, Kelly sort of erupts and he says, what's it going to take? And I'm paraphrasing here. He says, what's it going to take? A suicide bomber in an airplane for you all to wake up? And of course, that's exactly what's going to happen 18 months later. And so that's yet one of the other lessons, is that this was a new form of warfare, a new way to attack we just hadn't seen, and that we were going to be so slow to grasp.
For our audience, the rebel ouster of Bashar al-Assad only took place a couple of days before this recording, and Syria is going to continue to be quite a challenge for the United States and other Western countries for some time to come. But having followed Iran and Iran's surrogates for many years, I'm really glad to see that chain broken.
Yeah, I think we're all waiting to see what comes next. Well,
the book is called Targeted Beirut. It is a fascinating read, and I would like to thank both James Scott and Jack Carr for really having done some fabulous work.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate that. So does Jack.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.